Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hello, go and watch part 1 to this video. If you're returning, hi, and this is part 2. So in today's video I'm going to be speaking about preparing for your ASYE interview, but also some of what I speak about will be applicable to applying for social work jobs after your ASYE. So the ASYE interview, what is it all about? What are they looking for? What are they going to ask you guys? So you know, whenever I do a video I always come with examples. So I have got an example from a recent interview from a London borough, and I've also got my old test sheet from one borough that I applied for. When I looked, it was in 2020, but just to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect. But I'm gonna start off with, you know, before you even get to the ASYE stage. So I've spoke about this in, like, I believe my first or second ever video, third video about social work, in that the ASYE is very competitive, especially when you're looking for London. When I can only speak about London because, you know, that's where I'm from, but it's very competitive, especially when it comes to local authority, hence why I started in an independent fostering agency. But I just found that the local authority was just very competitive. So my advice to you now, if you're on your 100-day placement, you should be networking, like become besties with the managers, become besties with your team, your colleagues, and try to, like, get your foot in the door for real. Like, try to secure a place. Like, where I did my 100-day placement was in Hackney, and there was probably about 12 of us there. So the likelihood of them accepting all 12 was very unlikely. I think out of all of us, they only kept on maybe 2 or 3 people. So 1 in access and assessment, 1 in child protection, and 1 in, I believe she was in a LAC team or leaving care. So the rest of us got kicked out, but you know, they did keep on about 3 of them. But do, at this stage, if you are on your 100-day placement, or you're about to do it, or you know it's coming, you know, network, build those connections with managers, those in your team. Let them know, I want to do my ASYE. Have conversations around the ASYE, you know, to let them know that you do have an interest, because it is very competitive. However, when you do get to the stage that now it's okay, I've got my interview, you know, I'm about to start my ASYE year, they've seen something in me that they like, what do I do now? What are they gonna ask me? So they know that you've just come from university, so they know you've got this breadth of knowledge and you're fresh and you're still excited, you've got high energy, you know. It's like, okay, now I want to get into my ASYE, I want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. So they do know that you're still in a place where you don't know it all, that hence why you're going into another training year. So for for those of you that are watching this and you don't know what the ASYE is, it stands for the Assessed and Supported Year in Employment. So essentially it's an additional year after university where you still are supposed to get a lower caseload. Does that happen? A lower caseload, and you're meant to have extra supervision. You would still have your reflective practice, but essentially you're just meant to receive a bit more support than if you was just to go straight into the role. So yeah, I do have notes, as I always have notes. So BASWA, which is the Professional Association for Social Workers, within their PCF, the Professional Capability Framework, there is a hierarchy. If you haven't seen it, you should know it, or you can just type in the Professional Capabilities Framework and it will kind of show you the stages or the levels that you'll be I guess developing in as a social worker. So that starts off with the point of entry to training, readiness for practice, end of first placement, end of last placement. Then you become a newly qualified social worker, which is where you will be if you're watching this video at this stage, before you go into becoming a qualified social worker, experienced, advanced, then strategic social worker. They tend to follow this format, so that will also base how they ask their questions, because they know you're not, obviously they're not going to ask a newly qualified social worker advanced social worker questions, because they know you're not at that stage yet. So one thing that you need to know, they will potentially ask you about the PCFs, and they'll potentially ask you about the KSS and how you've been able to meet that on your 70-day and 100-day placement. So before they interview you, they're gonna ask, they will most likely, I'm trying to think if they asked me for that. I think they did ask me to see my portfolio. So they tend to ask you, you know, for your social work portfolio, which will give them a bit of an idea of where you are at in your development, how they can further develop you in your role and in your ASYE year to also meet your targets to pass your ASYE year. Do know and go over the PCFs, do go over the KSS, know it. So I think when I was on, I wouldn't actually say when I started my ASYE, it's more so when I was on my 100-day placement. I would also have like my notebook with like a printout from Google that I would stick in my sheet just to have them there. It's always a conversation you're going to be having in your supervisions anyway, how you meet in your PCFs. When you finish your ASYE year, that's something that you're going to have to reflect and show anyway, how you've been able to meet them. So another thing to bear in mind as well when you're applying for your ASYE is to make sure you read the job description and the person specification. Make sure you go through that thoroughly. There was an interview I had, story time, because it was a mess. Like, I was so embarrassed. I just thought, like, let me tell you guys what happened. So this was in lockdown. So my interview for, what borough was it? I think it was Southwark. I think it was Southwark. It was a mess. Oh my god, I'll never forget this. So I had an interview with Southwark for my ASYE. So I didn't realise that I applied for leaving care, which I didn't mind because at the time I wanted to do it. But I thought I was applying for access and assessment. So everything that I read and prepared for was in preparation for access and assessment. And then, child, when I got into that interview, they started asking me questions about the gangs matrix. Like, I knew that anyway from working in a LAC team and being in Hackney and working with contextual safeguarding and stuff. I knew that. But they were asking me these questions that I didn't know what they were talking about. And let me tell you guys something. The computer kept freezing. So I was looking at, like, obviously it's a home interview, so I had notes around me. I was looking at notes and I didn't realise that although the screen was freezing, they could see me. I have to just laugh because I was so embarrassed. And then I just kept saying, can you hear me? Can you see me? While I'm trying to look at my notes, because I was frazzled in that interview. How can you go to... Anyway, it was a mess and I didn't get it clearly why I'm in the job I'm in today. But please read the job description. Please read the person specification. Please, you know, prepare around that. So for example, if the job description is access and assessment, child protection, make sure that you're preparing for that role. Another thing as well is to identify what skills you've developed and what you can bring to the organization. What did you learn on your 70-day placement? What did you learn on your 100-day placement? Like, I wouldn't say so much the 70-day placement, but the 100-day placement is where it counts and where they've been able to see your commitment to those 100 days. So make sure you speak about what you learned. Don't just speak about what skills you developed, what was good. Also speak about some areas of weakness. Also speak about some areas that you think maybe I could actually develop here, because they want to hear that as well. Because you're not an expert. We're never going to be experts, but or other people would argue that, but there's always something to learn, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, speak to them about that. Give them examples of, you know, if they say, okay, give me an example of a case. I'll go into some example questions in a moment. But if they say, give me an example of a case you've worked with that challenged you or made you think differently. I feel like I get that in like most interviews that I have. So, you know, have these examples ready. Have, you know, the cases that you, I don't like to call them cases because they're people, but the cases that you have had worked with, and have them in mind for how you can really show your skill set. So how you can really show how you worked as part of a team, how you can show where you advocated, how you can show, you know, where you was professional, how you can show where you was faced with a challenge and you was able to provide a solution. Have all of this stuff fresh in your mind. So I'm gonna go through like an example interview. So what I remember as well is when I was applying for my ASYEs, before you get to the interview stage, or if you do your interview, sometimes they require you to do a role play, or they require you to do a test. So I think was that, I think actually one of them required me to do a test, and one of them required me to do like a role play with other applicants. So do bear that in mind as well. Sometimes it's not just, I don't ever think it's a straight interview. I may be wrong because when I did mine it was a few years ago, but sometimes they may require those additional stuff as well. I'm going to give you an example of a test, and then I'm going to give you an example of interview questions. So when I did this, I'm not going to say what local authority is for, but when I did this ASYE test, they asked me 4 questions based on a case study. I don't actually do you know what, I think I'll upload these. I will upload it, and I will just, because this is from 2020, if these local authorities are still using material from them, then they're not really being smart about it. So I will upload these into a document for you guys to access them and see them a bit clearer. But so in this test they gave me 4 questions based on a case study. It's about a mother who had an 8-year-old child, a son, 8-year-old, and her partner. Okay, so with this mother, she had a child for her partner, and also a son that wasn't her partner's child. The partner had been diagnosed with bipolar. Essentially, it just looks like there was some DV, and also he was using substance misuse, alcohol. The mother was struggling to cope with that and also raise her son, who was presenting with some issues in the home. Also, there was some neglect from the children. They weren't being fed, clothed, arriving to school late, extremely underweight and withdrawn. So I'm just trying to, like, I don't want to read it out, but that's just like a summary of it basically. So what in that scenario, they ask the following questions, which are: what are your 3 priority concerns for this family, and why are they of significance to you? The second question is: reflect on what assumptions, preconceptions you might have about this case and the impact that this could have on the child and their family. The third question is: what steps might you take to test out your assumptions or preconceptions? And the fourth question was, or is, what is likely to impact upon the child if he continues to live in these circumstances, and what might you do to support the family? Okay, so I guess the aim of them providing a test like this is they want to see, okay, can this person provide a solution? Can they carry out an assessment? You know, how can they problem solve? What solutions can they bring? Can they work with complex cases, complex families? Can they work with families that have multiple issues going on at one time? So they're just trying to better understand, okay, have you got that skill set yet? Would you know what to do? Okay, so I'm also going to read out an example or a few questions from an interview from another local authority. So they asked, can you speak about your experience of your 100-day and 70-day placement? Have you ever had experience of user consultation and participation, focusing on the needs of service users and carers? Do you have a detailed knowledge of the framework for the assessment of children and families? Have you had experience of formulating care plans which consider the range of services appropriate to children, young people, their carers and families? Can you give an example of how you previously worked with partner agencies and have negotiated to resolve differences of opinion to guarantee the relationship was not negatively affected? Can you provide an example of when you have undertaken complex social work assessment and practice which fully take into consideration the child, young person's background and lifestyle choices? And the last question on this is, can you explain how you would use principles from the Children's Act to ensure that the needs of the child and family were met? Sometimes in interviews, they always tend to ask a question around, if it's either supervision, you know, what is supervision for? what makes an effective supervision. They tend to ask questions around teamwork, so what makes a good team. So those are like other questions that they may throw in as well. One thing I'll say, sometimes for me personally, sometimes when I get to interview stage and I'm prepping and I see questions like this, sometimes wording can just throw me off. So don't be afraid to like say to whoever's interviewing you, sorry, could you repeat that question again? Okay, I'm gonna answer the first part of the question and then I'll come back to answer the second part of the question. Don't rush an interview. If you've got water, sip your water and, you know, take a breather, because sometimes I think, for me personally, when I get to interviews, things like that can throw me off a bit. So I might say, okay, can we come back to that? Or okay, I'll answer the first part of the question before I answer the second part of the question, just to allow myself to calm my nerves and actually try to answer as clearly as I can. If I had another tip to offer you guys, I think I mentioned it before, but just learning a bit about the organization, learning about what models they use. So some local authorities, they may work on a secure based model, some may have a systemic approach, you know, like try to find out about that local authority or agency or wherever it is you're applying for. Try to find out about the organization as well. That's very important, because that will underpin your work and how you work. Going along the same lines of, you know, knowing the organization, know also the demographic within the borough. So for example, who are your service users? Who are you going to be working with? What do they look like? For example, if you're working in Hackney, it's going to be a very different service user group demographic to if you're in Hillingdon, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to throw in 2 more questions that they may ask you as well, which is around prioritizing your caseload. This is probably a very popular, it's actually a pretty popular question that comes up. You know, how do you prioritize your workload? How do you prioritize your caseload? How do you manage stress? You know, all these kind of questions they want to know. What are you like when you're under pressure? And I guess the main takeaway for preparing your interview is make sure that in everything you're speaking about, you're not just trying to say, oh, you know, everything about theory, everything that you just learn on the course, or making it seem like a university interview again. This is now preparing you for social work. This is actually your first step into life without the holding hands of your lecturers and the patting on the back from your, you know, your peers on your course. Like, now it's time to actually learn how to stand on your own. So just make sure that in everything that you're speaking about, everything that they're asking you, you're relaying it back to practice, you're relaying it back to your experiences. They want valuable staff. They want people that, you know, they can really train and equip to be the best social workers that they can be. They want staff, you know, they want retention as well. They want staff that's gonna stay. So if they ask you questions as well around, you know, your future goals, your future planning, what's next, you may, I mean, it's a very big thing. Like, a lot of people tend to do the ASYE somewhere and then they move on straight away. But try to make sure you're coming across in a way that you are there to add value and bring value to that local authority, to that independent agency, wherever it is that you're applying for. And you want to stay, you want to learn, you want to be trained, you want to be equipped. That's why you're doing the extra ASYE year, because you want to learn and be able to stand on your own 2 feet, so that when pressures come, you're not like crumbling in the corner. So yeah, hopefully these tips helped you, and the examples that I will leave and I will share in the description below will be a bit helpful for you as well, hopefully. But it was nice to see you guys, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.